First World War interrupted what might have been Coventry's smooth progress towards a new industrial revolution and moved it instead towards the production of modern weapons of war. The men of the Royal Warwicks were joined at the front by aeroplanes, bombs, shells and other military equipment manufactured in their hometown. Young women found their feet standing at benches fixing patented clockwork fuses to the shells of the Royal Artillery. Throughout the war, up until 1917, a royalty of 1 penny was dutifully paid by the Treasury through Swiss banks to the inventors of the fuses and patent holders, the Germans. After the armistice came the Depression, but for Coventry there was, at least to some extent, a peace dividend. And in the 1920s, there was still a class well off enough to buy the products of her motor industry. Coventry remained at the forefront of modern technology. For the working classes, there was the Coventry-built bicycle. For the better off, the Coventry-built motorcycle. And for the distinctly wealthy, the Coventry-built motor car. In the evening, the family could gather round and listen to the Coventry-made wireless radio. In 1937, HMS Coventry was with the Home Fleet at the Spithead Naval Review, and like many of the other ships, she was equipped with radio telegraph systems, whose components were made in Coventry. Across the Channel, the inequalities of the Depression and unemployment, allied to the bitterness engendered by the terms of surrender after World War I, had spawned a different age and a new political interpretation: fascism. Italy's Mussolini invented it, but the murderous refinement of the movement was left to Germany's Adolf Hitler. Fascism was on the march, determined to regain Germany's dominant position in pacifist Europe. When German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland, France and the League of Nations did nothing. Had they known that Hitler's generals had secret orders to retreat at the slightest sign of resistance, they might have done otherwise. There was no stopping him. Austria was next. And despite wishful thinking from other League members, the Anschluss was a move not without considerable support in Hitler's country of birth. But still, other League members seemed oblivious to Hitler's global ambitions, and even in the late 1930s, the sight of a swastika held no fears to these Warwickshire flyers enjoying a day's sport with their German friends over northern England. It was only when the Germans started to train Spanish pilots for the Civil War there that several began to doubt the wisdom of a return visit to Rangsdorf airfield in Berlin. Next, it was the Sudetenland, and more German-speaking people were absorbed into Hitler's growing empire, whether Czechoslovakia liked it or not. At last, the West began to wake up, and the military order books were reopened for Coventry's factories. But the West was still powerless to resist Hitler's aggression. There was to be no peace in our time, and in September 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, France and Britain at last declared war on Germany, though they could do little to help the Poles, especially when they were invaded by Russia from the east. As their forebears had done in 1914, the Royal Warwick's regulars and territorials embarked for France as part of the British Expeditionary Force. As with their forebears, much of their equipment was made in Coventry. They were the most mobile army Britain had ever put into the field, and morale was high. The BEF took up positions along the Belgian border, while the French manned the impregnable Maginot Line. Both armies waited. With the Germans seemingly content to sit behind their own defensive Siegfried Line, there was little real activity. But the phony war did not last for long. Dunkirk, humiliating defeat, or incredible escape. Whichever way you look at it, the despair of the men and women involved was as plain to see then as it is today.
The tanks we had, I think they had about two, as far as I can see, I had a 2-pounder gun on them. Well, against those German tanks that were coming down, these panzers and that, well, they were like paper. Well, they just fly through us. The people that saved us actually there, the people that holding the line for us, they must have been brave blokes as well. I was with them, advanced medical unit, and we went out in sections, say 6 or 8 of us at a time with an officer, right through the front line. The sights I saw there.
Unbelievably, back home in Coventry, no government provision had been made for evacuating children. Coventry was considered, in the words of the official document, unlikely to suffer attack from the air, and it was therefore excluded from the government scheme. There were those who could have reminded them that in October 1917, Zeppelins passed over Coventry on their way to bomb Birmingham, and with the declaration of war, Coventry's local authority insisted that children from approved zones, the more congested areas in and around the city centre, be registered. But only a third of the children eligible arrived at the dispersal areas, some 3,300 children in all. Faced with the reality of war, the air raid precautions and other voluntary emergency services, such as the auxiliary fire service and the local defence volunteers, were quickly established and training began. Equipment was desperately short and improvisation was the order of the day. Car bumpers and running boards were painted white to make them more visible during the blackout, but initially at least, more people were killed in traffic accidents due to the blackout than by the bombing. The authorities knew that incendiary bombs would be used. The British government had, after all, sold them by the thousand to Germany only a few short years earlier. But gas bombs were the most feared weapon, and Coventry was not alone in holding gas attack exercises in the city centre. 38 million gas masks were manufactured, and there was one even for the smallest baby. Even the factories took time off to drill employees for the expected attacks, much to the irritation of the workers, who felt that the drills went on long after the danger of gas attack had passed. The city was further disrupted by the building of shelters, but later it was found that the early ones were more dangerous to be in than out of, as a two-solid mortar mix caused the walls to collapse far too easily from blast, killing and maiming all inside. In early 1940, the only aerial activity of any note was an RAF Hampden bomber of 106 Squadron hitting barrage balloon cables and crashing onto the cricket ground. Behind me is all that's left of Armstrong's factory, a reclad and refurbished giant hangar. But initially, a problem even worse than the Germans was the industrial unrest that dogged companies like Armstrong's and other factories producing aircraft engines. But by now, most workers had 2 jobs.
I started work at the Sterling Metals, which worked in magnesium, aluminium. It produced aircraft parts, things like that. And when the war broke out, in the early days, the LDV was formed. The first thing we got was a bit of a laugh for us all, because all the managers were marching around the roadways in the works with broomsticks over their shoulders. You know, it was quite a laugh to see all the top people doing that kind of thing, you know. But anyway, later on I decided I wanted to join the LDV. So I went to see this Captain White. He had a little office in our fire station, our works fire station. And he took all the details, name and etc., and then age. He said, "Oh, you're not old enough." We said, I don't know. He says, you're a big chap. He says, okay, you know. And so I was in the LDV.
I was working at Armstrong Whitworth Aerodrome. I was apprentice there, and during the first part of the war I was a member of the ARP in the first aid party, and a bit later on I transferred to the Home Guard in the Works Division. And of course we had plenty of nuisance raids before the main Blitz, when they were bombing Birmingham and surrounding Leicester and surrounding towns. But we were on the alert, and we did have a lot of bombs dropped around Coventry at the time, before the main Blitz. Once when I was called out, I was sent to take a message from where we were to the command post. A bright moonlight night as usual, and I was cycling along this country lane, and I heard this aircraft coming behind me, and suddenly the sound of machine guns and little blue lights were dancing around the road in front of me. A very poor gunner, while that I was cycling very erratically because it never hit me. I thought, what the hell with you? What am I going to do? Get in the ditch or keep going? So I just kept going. I mean, there's plenty of water in the ditch. I don't want to get wet.
In the summer of 1940, invasion seemed imminent, with only the fighter planes of the RAF standing between Britain and Nazi occupation. Without the Alvis Motor Company producing superchargers for the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines powering the Spitfire and Hurricanes, and other factories producing alloys and airframes, the outcome of the Battle of Britain may well have been very different. Coventry was now working to capacity. More and more women were called on to stand at benches and lathes once occupied by men.
You took on the men's jobs and you were proud to struggle to get to their standard and to carry on while your man was at the war. It changed slightly when the Blitz started because you might have been up all night, but your colleague might have been in the shelter that was hit. You didn't complain about your husband because other people's husbands were killed or missing. You just counted your blessing and you got on with it, and we worked about 68 hours a week, and we came back and managed our lives as well as we could. They weren't unhappy times, but they were sort of waiting time, waiting for the end of the war, waiting for your man to come home. You prayed that he would come home.
When the first serious air raids began over Coventry in June-July 1940, the government ministry responsible for evacuation had to revise their opinion that Coventry was unlikely to be bombed, and the whole city was declared part of the evacuation scheme. Unfortunately, by then it was too late, with most parents against the idea, and the majority of children registered stayed at home.
Now, when the war started, I was 16, and I worked at the Bryco at Holbrooks Lane. And the first indication of anything in the way of hostilities was a daylight raid, and people were that blasé, I suppose, that they walked out of the shelter to have a look at the plane coming over. And it was only a single raider, and from all accounts it dropped a bomb on the Standard Motor Company.
I can remember having large classrooms and large numbers of children in the class. In fact, in one of my school reports, I noticed that there were 58 children in one class. And we all had to behave ourselves and all pay attention, as most of the work was written on the board. As paper was scarce, we had slate boards and chalk to do some of our practice of writing. And I remember shells were also used as counters. And I'm surprised with the sort of interruptions there were during our school days that we really learned anything.
About October 1940, I went to the Daimler Aero Engines at Radford, and they were working a two-shift system, 6 till 10 and 6 till 2 and 2 till 10, and it was alternate. I think we did a fortnight about. Well, on the late shift, about 6:30 every night, almost without fail, there was what they call a nuisance raid. It probably wasn't a nuisance to those that were involved. It was just as dramatic as if it was something like the Blitz. But we used to stop work and go into the shelters perhaps for about an hour and a half to 2 hours and then resume.
And every morning we used to have a check with our gas masks to make sure that they were working. And we stood in a queue and we went to the teacher at the front, and she put a piece of paper underneath the gas mask, and we had to breathe in and make sure that this piece of paper would be held onto the gas mask, and we carried them around with us wherever we went. Even when we were playing games outside, our gas masks were with us all the time.
As the battle for air supremacy raged above them, Coventry's anti-aircraft batteries had at least one success when a Heinkel 111 of Kampfergruppe 1 crashed in the countryside. With the regular army in disarray after the debacle at Dunkirk, the Home Guard trained hard for the street-to-street and hand-to-hand fighting that Churchill promised the German invaders. Heavy weapons and even rifles were in short supply, and for this unit training in the Warwickshire countryside, the most important piece of their equipment was an old parachute and a length of rope, as they rehearsed tactics to counter the German armoured fighting vehicles. It is perhaps fortunate that the Home Guard were never called upon to face the full fury of the German blitzkrieg, but there can be little doubt that these volunteers would have fought to the bitter end if need be. But as the Luftwaffe failed to take command of the skies, there was a change in tactics. In the prelude to Coventry's Blitz, 7 innocent old ladies and their matrons were killed in these almshouses on October the 14th, 1940. Ford's Hospital stands as an example of the architectural mix that was Coventry's city centre pre-war. Medieval, Elizabethan, classical, and 19th century industrial. Ford's Hospital was carefully rebuilt after the war. The raids on the 12th and 14th of October killed 19 people and injured 69. It was the beginning of the night offensive. Coventry's war production, although hindered by industrial unrest and even demands for peace negotiations, was at its highest level. It was a centre for aircraft engine production, motor transport, and arms. Her industrial output made it an inevitable target for the Luftwaffe. They came in force by accident or design on the day that Neville Chamberlain, the appeaser of Munich, was buried, November the 14th, 1940.
Before the war and during the war, my rank in the Works Fire Service of Roots Stoke Factory was Deputy Chief. We, of course, did ARP training quite a bit and a few years before the war with the Coventry City Fire Service. We would train how to deal with various bombs, incendiary bombs, that kind of thing, and recognition of bomb damage, etc., which we learnt quite a bit before the war, although during the war we found things just a little bit different to what we'd practiced and so forth.
The Luftwaffe was using a new tactic, the Brandenbombfeld, or firebomb field. Initially they dropped high explosives to fracture gas mains, sever electricity lines, destroy roofs and walls and upset stoves. Into this melee they dropped thousands of magnesium incendiary bombs, which consumed exposed timber floorboards and anything flammable. To call it a blitz was a misnomer. It was an extension of the strategy of blitzkrieg. This was Firestorm, or the firestorm.
We took shelter in the barracks square. The shelter next to us was hit. There were shutters lying everywhere, and debris and craters. But we just felt we had to keep moving. I think that the momentum was getting home to our mother, because she was on her own.
I remember the night of the Blitz, we never went in the shelter because we knew they weren't concentrating on us. It was just as though the planes came as far as Bedworth and turned round for a rerun onto Coventry. And the sky was blood red everywhere. And you just looked out and you spoke to your neighbour in hushed tones because you knew of the people that were dying there.
At 8:10, I remember the controller saying to me, Watkin, take your crew and go into Broadgate and help the city because they've got trouble with Owens, and you better go out and see if you can help. So I and my crew, there were only 4 of them and me, went into the city, and we managed to get into Broadgate quite reasonably and easily. See, towing a pump. I'd got a Hawk Humber car to take the pump with us, and we got into Broadgate, and at that time, even then, Owens was all on fire, flames coming out of the windows and the roofs, and I thought, well, we can't do anything there anyway, that's far too gone for any help there.
The sirens went at 12 minutes past 7. By 20 past 7, incendiaries were doing their work. By 8:30, the cathedral was alight, and by 20 to 8, it was burning fiercely. Just before 10 o'clock, the emergency phones went out of action, and bicycle messengers were the only line of communication. The raid went on for hours.
My mother had written a letter to my auntie, and we went up the road to post it, and as we was going up, the sirens went, so the bombs started falling then, and we called in at the navigation pub to see my dad was all right and to tell him where we was going home. But of course, while we was there, the firemen came in, you know, all blackened up. They'd been very busy. So mother and I went walking on, and they wouldn't let us go by the Morris shelters, so we spent the night in there, and which seemed a very, very long night, and people kept coming in with the clothes over their arm.
I went down the cellar, and all I'd got was 3 candles and my 2 cats. And as the night wore on, the candles went out, and the bombing just kept on all the time. It was terrific. And then across in Lower Ford Street, there was a big foundry. That had a direct hit, and all the castings were flung over to the house. The door came off, the windows came out, but I was still down the cellar. And the lady next door, I think her name was West, she had 3 sons. And they kept on tapping on the wall, you know, was I all right? Did they want me to break, did they want to break the wall down to come through? And I said, no, I'll be all right.
I never felt frightened particularly. We were too busy. The blast from some of the bombs, I mean, if we stood in Hale Street looking down Corporation Street in the firelight and the moonlight, you could see very large bombs dropping in the further part of the city, you see. And there were local bombs around us, but not in Hale Street, not explosive ones. But there were some around, and the blast blew holes in our hose. Oh, it blew a piece of hose away 3-4 feet long, you see. That would be just blast. And, all right, you just turn the water off and put another length of hose in and start it off again, you see.
Shortly after midnight, there were fires reported all over Coventry, as incendiary bombs rained down on the city. The emergency services were overwhelmed.
We met a family, a man and wife, and I don't know, 2 or 3 children, and they were looking for shelter. So I thought we'd try and get them into the Livingston Road, which is the nearest thing to us. And the bombs started to fall down then at that moment, and we took refuge in a small toilet that was, I mean, it sounds silly now, but I mean, it sounded all right then at the time. It was shelter, if you like, you know. And we went into this toilet. It was at the top of Livingston Road at the time, for a few minutes, just while it lulled a bit, you know. And then we headed back towards the shelter. Of course, they wouldn't take them in. It was completely full. So they told us the next one was under the Bryco Bridge. Bryco was another factory which just down the road. And they'd filled the bridge, the archways of the bridge, bricked it up and made shelters under the bridge, you know. So we took them down to there, and they accepted them. And we stayed there a little while, and then decided to make another attempt back to the works, in which we did. We got back to our works, but unfortunately it had been burnt down, bombed down, it was flat. The firemen there, they began to take control of the fires when it was a pattern shop, and the pattern stores were over the top, which was all wood anyway. That was on fire, and then the firemen, just so they were getting it under control, it must have been a mains burst or a bomb burst on the mains, and cut the water off. And so Sterling Metals burnt down that night.
We didn't have any casualties in the patients or staff, but we had raid victims coming in, and then we couldn't do much for them because just after midnight we were out of water, heat and water. But I remember I was on for minor casualties, and I was stitching with bowls of Dettol, big bowls of Dettol, and I could stitch ordinary head wounds and minor cuts with that. And I remember taking them over to the nurses' home if they could walk. One particular woman had a head stitches and I had stitched her head, and she'd been in the pantry. Lots of people went in the pantry or under the stairs those days, and the place had come in on her. And I walked her over to the nurses' home where they were all lying there on stretchers. She said, "I'm not going in there, they're all dead." So I had to get them to put their hands up to say they were all alive. Needless to say, I think she got over it all right.
We did run out of water at the factory about 2 o'clock in the morning. And that was that. And about 5 o'clock, I thought, well, we could do with some help. So I went to Stoke-Aldermore factory, which was next door, which was part of our sort of roots emporium, as it were, and asked for help. And they said, well, we can't let, because our pump had broken down, and we can't lend you ours in case we want it, you see. And then, so I went to the Wrighton factory, and they'd only had one bomb at Wrighton, and they all just sat round, and that was that. And I said, can I have some help? Because we were up to there. I was covered in red paint because we'd had a bomb hit a primer tank, and we'd got red paint all over the place, about 4 inches deep on the floor. And they said, well, we'll come when the all clear has sounded. So I couldn't get any help anywhere, but got back near to the factory across, and I heard some bombs coming down, and Reg West again was with me, one of my men, and we stood in the doorway and saw the bomb explode, which blew up our own central control and injured the manager and 2 firemen in there who were taking messages and that kind of thing. Ernie Strubig and Bert Earl were in there. They were message takers and so forth. And one had some fractured ribs and the other had a broken leg, and that was that.
Out at Exhall, there was an ack battery in the field just behind the house. And they ran out of ammunition about midnight. And you could see the German planes circling over the fields, getting ready to make the bombing run into the town. See the crosses on the underside of the wings, they're that low, circling round. They're powerless to do anything about it. I mean, I got my rifle, I let off a few rounds, but once they'd gone, you were powerless. I mean, you couldn't reach them with a bayonet.
One incident, while we were standing outside of the shelter, we were looking towards the city, which was just a big red glow and all just silhouettes. And we could see Court all silhouetted against the skyline, and all the fires were around that area. And we could see the landmines drifting down with the parachutes, just gently drifting to earth, you know, not knowing at the time or realizing what they were. But later on, as I say, as we went to Coventry, one of these landmines had exploded in what was Eagle Street, and at least half the street was flattened, the houses had gone.
It would be about 5 o'clock, and they said, oh, we've got some water, we're going to try and make a cup of tea. So one of the sons said, we'll come round and fetch you, you say. So anyway, eventually I comes up up the cellar steps to the front door, which, as I say, had gone, and he met me. And I will never, ever forget what I saw. The roads were just swimming in water. There was fires, there was incendiary bombs, there was things like tracer bullets across the sky. Oh, it was absolutely terrible. And eventually they get me round there. And remember, I'm 7 months pregnant. And they waited for my husband to come. Well, it took him till 10 o'clock the next morning to come home. He'd come from the Daimler, trying to get through to me, because he was on nights, trying to get through to me. He'd lost his bike, he'd been blowed up in a shelter and God knows what.
Willie Monk, a Luftwaffe wireless operator, had been on many raids over Polish, French and British cities. He left a record of what he saw on that night.
Heute Abend ist der große Einsatz. Mondscheinsonate. Ein Großangriff gegen ein Zentrum der britischen Kriegsindustrie, nämlich Coventry. Wir sind unter den Letzten, die gestartet haben. Wetter sehr gut, klare Himmel mit einem guten Mond. Wir sind bald über dem Kanal. Wir fliegen in eine Reihe, eine direkt nach dem anderen, nach Anton. Der Himmel ist so klar, dass wir ihn kaum brauchen. Fast wie der helle Tag. Wir sind am Hauptsignal vorbei. Die Bomben sind abwurfbereit. Wir haben Sprengladungen und Brandbomben. Man zählt die Abstände ab, bis wir über der Stadt sind. Es ist 23:30 Uhr. Die Stadt brennt schon. Ich greife nach der Halskette, die ich von meiner Mutter habe. Wir merken es kaum, wenn unsere Bomben automatisch abgeworfen werden. Obwohl wir 3000 Meter hoch fliegen, können wir die brennende Stadt unter uns riechen. Den roten Schein im Himmel sehen wir fast den ganzen Weg nach Burg zurück.
The November raid on Coventry was extraordinary, not least for the fact that so many Luftwaffe bombers reached and bombed their target. 449 out of 450. The 450th, a Dornier 17, was shot down by anti-aircraft fire, and it crash-landed in the grounds of Presswold Hall near Burton-on-the-Wolds. The Home Guard were dispatched immediately to look over the wreckage. Its crew of 4, on a mission to bomb Cornercraft Works and Hill Street Gasworks in Coventry, now lie here in Loughborough Cemetery. The last bomber left the city at 5:35, 10 hours after the bombing had started. When dawn came just after 8 o'clock, the survivors came out of their cellars and shelters.
Later on that morning, I did try to get to work, and got in there, and I got as far as Eagle Street, and down the bottom of Eagle Street to House Street, and I had to leave my bike on the side, and I had to pick me way over rubble in the road, and wrecked cars, and traffic that had been all mangled, twisted and burnt, and houses were all lying across the road in debris. And it was very eerie, really, because it was quite foggy. And of course the smoke from the fires was still burning, and smoke was drifting across. It was very eerie. And you saw a few people wandering round. Rescue workers were very tired and weary, and 1 or 2 people that were left in the vicinity, they all seemed dazed with shock and, wondering what to do. Eventually I had to give up and go back home. I couldn't get through any further.
Well, you were just completely paralysed with fright because the next one was yours and you were going to get blown to the winds. But it wasn't. The bombs dropped on the back of the house and on the front of the house, leaving the house back and front like a doll's house, just floors sticking out. And when my dad came to move the furniture, what was in the coal truck, my dear husband was there, and he opened the bathroom door, and 2 of the floors fell down. You can imagine he was great at swearing, and he got some choice things to say. Anyway, coming back to the night, we were under the stairs. The bombs had gone, and we were all very, very shaken. And the chappie across the road came over with a saucepan on his head, the handle sticking out. Well, your thing was, do we laugh hysterically or cry?
I have never, ever seen such a crater as was at the end of Lower Ford Street, outside the Alexandria Theatre. Well, not one double-decker bus. You'd have got about 6 in it. It was a landmine what had dropped.
This particular night, I'd just got home and had my tea, and I'd gone upstairs to put my trousers on, and when there was this shuddering noise, and I ran down to my mum. My dad had put wooden shutters up for the best thing, and it didn't really shatter any windows, but it cracked all the walls, and we wondered what it was. Well, we eventually learned that it was this unexploded bomb 2 doors away. There was a great big crater there, so of course eventually they came and said we'd have to be evacuated.
There were thousands of tragedies that night. Some people are still living with them. They can't all be described in the reverent detail they deserve. One of those tragedies took place here, near Greyfriars Green, in a terrace of houses. High explosives and incendiaries had reduced domesticity to a smoking ruin and a death trap. Wardens and firemen heard a noise, a voice, coming from under the rubble. The voice said that there were 12 people trapped, and could they be rescued? As preparations were made, an order came to evacuate the whole area. There were 2 unexploded bombs that needed defusing. By the time anyone came back, 3 days later, only 1 of that 12 came out alive. 555 people were killed, and 1,050 people were injured. But for many survivors, the trauma did not end with the all-clear siren.
There were 2 young men came along with steel helmets on, and one had got his arm round the shoulders of the other and turned to me and said, "What can I do with this young man?" And his left eye was out and hanging on his cheek. Well, I couldn't do anything. I'd been in first aid for some years before that, but I mean, I was too busy to do first aid. I got other things to see to. And I said, well, the only thing you can do is, there's the fire station, which was the end of Hale Street. which is now known as the old fire station, of course. I said, take him along there. And what happened to him, goodness knows.
There was one man, they were on stretchers, and I passed and he said, "Oh, nurse, my arm, my arm." And it was dangling, and I lifted it up over him, put it over his breast, and I could feel his arm was actually away from his body, but the coat sleeve was still in one piece. And we had casualties that hadn't got a mark on them, but they were dead because of the blast. This particular night, when I was walking through the outpatients, they were all on stretchers round, and there was a vicar, a priest, praying, and I looked at some of the lamps. They had some of these hurricane lamps, and written on was "Made in Germany."
The emergency services did what they could, but the area around Broadgate and the medieval city centre had almost completely gone. Thousands of houses were either reduced to rubble or damaged beyond repair.
We went over the roads and sheltered there the rest of the night, and then we went round to our friend in Middlemarch, which is also parallel with the Daimler. She was very kind. She put us to bed with a drink of brandy, and we'd hardly sort of settled before the air raid warden was dashing round saying, "Get out, get out." There's a landmine just down the street. So we were off again. We would then walk to Exhall and were taken in. But before leaving the house, we put a note on the pillow of the wall outside, because the door and the house wall had gone, to tell my husband where we were and just where he could find us.
It was absolutely horrible, horrifying, devastating. To think that you know what we'd come to.
George Eliot, the 19th century female novelist, went to school in Coventry. An original manuscript of her greatest novel, The Mill on the Floss, a Shakespeare first folio, and 150,000 other books had fueled the flames. Coventry's city and industry were very badly damaged, but it was the awful suffering of the population that brought the King and Queen on the 16th of November for a much-needed morale-boosting tour. High explosives, parachute mines, and thousands upon thousands of incendiaries did their damage. British air intelligence knew that the Luftwaffe were planning a raid. They even knew its code name, Moonlight Sonata. But what they couldn't decipher was the essential part of the message that indicated the destination, Corn. They should have looked at their Midlands map. Corn means exactly the same as quorn, to grind down to nothing. Was it just coincidence that Quorn, just outside Loughborough, was directly beneath the coordinated flight paths that instructed Luftwaffe pilots to turn west for Birmingham or south for Coventry? The city might then have been warned. Coventry had been the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata, with other provincial cities such as Sheffield, Hull, Belfast, Liverpool, Plymouth, Southampton being the other movements. There was no need for the Luftwaffe to return to Coventry until April the 8th and 10th, 1941.
This night we had a direct hit. Well, as it happened, this shelter was built, there was a long alleyway, and then it divided into about 6 bunks, 3 aside, so you could go in. And this delayed action, it came straight through about 3 compartments from us, and it went straight through it, but it never exploded. Had it exploded, I wouldn't be here now, would I? And then another night we went down there, and this woman was having a baby. Oh, and she was screaming and screaming. I thought, oh, that's the end of it. I'm not going down there again.
As far as putting the incendiary bombs out was quite easy until they decided to put explosives in them. And the new method, which instead of putting several bombs out with 1 bag of sand, was to carry the bag of sand in front of you, face-wise, to the bomb when you first saw it, and drop the bag itself on the bomb, because not knowing whether it was the explosive type or the normal firebomb, you see.
The canteen above was hit, and all the firemen were killed, and the blast came down and blew the hatch off the escape hatch and hit me in the face. And I'd got poor Sylvia in my arms, and it must have hit her on the face, because 2 years afterwards she had a mastoid, and it was in that ear. And the doctor down in the hospital said it was caused through the shock of the blast, you know. But when it had direct hit, we were sat there in darkness, and the earth rocked, and the water was up to here, and everybody was screaming, and it's the end of the world, and we're all going to die, and there's a ring of fire, and well, I think everybody went hysterical, you know. Well, you would, wouldn't you? And but we didn't. We survived. We came home, and after that, I decided then never again would I go to a shelter. If I was going to be blowed up, I'd stay in my little house.
The April attacks were not as large as before, and damage to buildings and industry was not as great, but the casualty rate was almost as high as in November of the previous year. Nearly 400 people were killed and 1,000 injured.
We'd had quite a lot of bombs on the buildings, but up till 7 o'clock in the morning, we hadn't lost any staff or patients. But there was a bomb that had gone off in the night, and they put a plank across it, and it was at the main inquiry office, and people were going backwards and forwards over it. And there was a delayed action attached to it. And that did the damage. It killed 26 patients and 8 nurses, 2 doctors, sisters and staff nurses. That was tragic. I came across that plank. My friend had left to get married, and her husband came to see how I was. And I got blood all over my apron and my white boots on, and I came across the plank and saw the place go up behind me.
There was buckets of sand all down the roads, and we used to try and do the best with that. And in the little bucket pump we had as well.
During the late hours of Blitz, the roads were chock-a-block coming out of Coventry, with people, refugees, pushing the belongings in prams, barrows, carrying them bits of bedding and stuff on the back, going out to fields, into fields. And several nights afterwards, when we had the sirens went, same thing happened, all trekking out of Coventry. And we were on duty at Longford Bridge, stopping all vehicles going into the town, only allowing essential servicing like food and medical supplies and stuff for the ARP. But everything else was stopped from going in, sightseers or anybody like that. And oh, there's plenty of people curious to go in. Oh yes, gals, you'll be surprised.
This place is about 1,000 metres east of Humber Road to the south of Binley Road. Above this point, special German bombers flew, guided by the Luftwaffe's new secret weapon, Knickerbein. But it wasn't that secret. We knew how this radio direction finding and bomb aiming apparatus worked, and we could jam it with false signals. Unfortunately, on the night of November the 14th, 1940, someone forgot to correctly align the jamming mechanism. The beams radiated out from the continent perfectly, and they crossed about 6,000 feet above this pub, guiding a new sort of German airman, a Pathfinder. This, along with the weather, ensured that Coventry was precisely targeted with parachute flares and incendiaries. Incidentally, the wartime drinkers in the Bull's Head were the luckiest drinkers alive, because theoretically every bomb dropped on Coventry was released above this point. Fortunately, the worst damage that was done was when a parachuting airman fell through the roof and landed in a bedroom. By 1942, the tide of war had turned, and although there would be other nights in the shelters and cellars for Coventry's population, for them the worst was over. The November raid on Coventry had been the biggest raid yet experienced in Britain. With Coventry, the Luftwaffe changed tactics and strategy. It was the pattern of predictions made before the war, when they said the bomber will always get through. Mass formations of bombers wreaking havoc from the skies onto a largely unprotected population. H.G. Wells, things to come. With Coventry, they had come first, and with them they brought violent death on a scale never before known. They had to use mechanical shovels to dig the trenches for the mass graves for the victims, some of them unidentifiable. In wartime, there was no time for ceremony. In peace, there was time for a more permanent memorial. This memorial stands in the London Road Cemetery, and it's in memory of all Coventry's civilian war dead. Ruined and built anew, Coventry's cathedrals are potent symbols of the futility of war. Of the 59 cathedrals in Britain, St. Michael's was the only one to be destroyed, not by bombs, but by fire. But the damage inflicted on Coventry by the Luftwaffe was returned tenfold by the RAF and the American Air Force. They perfected the technique of the Firestorm after observing the experiment organized by the Luftwaffe over Coventry. They say if you have forgotten how to weep, go to Dresden, perhaps the most poignant example of the appalling destructive power of aerial bombardment. Dresden, Coventry's sister city in the futility of war, lost most of its churches and possibly more than 100,000 of its population, men, women and children. There's still argument about whether it was a British or a German propagandist who coined the word Coventrated to describe a city razed to the ground by aerial bombardment. Its derivation made little difference to the people of Coventry, their city in ruins around them. This place marks the beginning of post-war reconstruction. All levels were to be taken from this stone, the Phoenix Stone, for the building of the new modern city of Coventry.
Well, it's one of those things. We were at war. I could cheaply kill any German I saw. I suppose they could have done the same to me. I mean, it's the sort of condition you get yourself into. It's difficult to describe. Now, you know, I feel quite friendly towards the Germans. What Germans I know are quite friendly with them. But then, I mean, there wasn't a good German on a dead one. The same with the Japanese. But it's difficult to describe the feeling. You feel of, you know, hatred.
I think I was so young that the centre of the town didn't mean that much to me as it was. I can remember the prefabricated shops afterwards and how places like Woolworths and Marks and Spencer's were in Nissan huts. And we coped with any property that was standing was used for what was needed at the time. And we walked many miles from one side of the town to the other to get to shops that were still there. Some of them that would normally have been in the city centre were put to the outskirts where there was property that had not been destroyed, because the centre of the town almost disappeared.
I remember it as it was before, a beautiful city, and it was a beautiful city, and now it's just, well, a hodgepodge of different buildings instead of the lovely things that were there before, that we remember in our younger teenage days.